people's details correct. Brian, welcome up again. Thank you very much. Feel free to give him a warm reception back on the stage.
Where Sylvia says uses personal pronouns, I will use those personal pronouns, and you'll just have to pretend that I am Sylvia Keesmaat. She's titled her comments, Grounded in This Place, Resident Aliens 25 Years Later. My reflection on Resident Aliens are rooted, ironically, in reflections on place. I say ironically because this is a book that uses a metaphor of those who are displaced, those who have no legitimate place, to describe those who follow Jesus. And yet this is a book that is shaped quite dramatically by the place of its authors. This is not just because the authors start by describing a widespread cultural shift away from Christendom in the experience of young people in Greenville, South Carolina in 1963, nor because so many of the stories of the embodied church happen in specific places in the southern United States. Rather, it is the nationality of Hauerwas and Willimon that has given a unique shape to the book. I don't mean this as a criticism, for how could it be otherwise? But it is true that this book is shaped fundamentally by concerns of the church as it is found in the United States. Let me explain. While there might be some in Canada, particularly in the mainline churches, who would agree that Christendom did indeed exist and that is now in wane, there are others for whom the whole model of Christendom disappeared almost a century ago. For many of us in Canada, members of immigrant churches and children of immigrant parents, the idea of a Christian society never had any purchase. In my own experience, in particular as a child of parents born during the German occupation of Holland, it was eminently clear that the societal forces that shaped our time had little to do with following Jesus and much to do with the powers of darkness. The language of liberalism that permeates this book, therefore, along with the language of Christendom, has the feel of concerns peculiar to theologians from the United States. Fair enough. That's the context in which it was written. Tied in with that, however, is a concern with civil religion, as it is uniquely found in the United States. In fact, the authors state that the new universal religion that demands subservience is not Marxism or capitalism, but the entity both of these serve so well, the omnipotent state. This is a startling statement, even in 1989 when this book was released, because it was clear even then that global capitalism was steadily eroding the boundaries of nations, with the result that the political power of the state was dramatically undermined. Even before Fukuyama declared in 1990 that history had ended because liberal democratic capitalism had won the battle of ideological dominance, it was clear that capitalism became the god to which even the government and the people of the United States was in bondage. Maybe that was harder to see from south of the border for those of us maybe that was harder to see from the south of the border. For those of us at the edge of empire, the signs were unmistakable. One simply remembers on 9/11, America is still open for business, offered as pastoral counsel and encouragement to the people by the president. This might be why Chapter 2, Christian Politics in the New World, sets up a false dichotomy between the church and the world, or church and culture. For as the authors point out, there is so much accommodation, so much that is worldly in the church, that it's hard to see where this entity called the church exists, this church that is shaped by the story of how God is with us. But more than that, and conversely, and not noted by the authors, there are so many places where those outside of the institutional church are faithful to their promises, love their enemies, honor the poor, and suffer for righteousness, that it is clear that God's reconciling grace is at work far beyond the walls of those who claim to follow Jesus. This is, in the Calvinist tradition of my forebears, called common grace, and it makes it hard, in my mind, to drive any kind of wedge, or at least sharp wedge, between church and world. That said, I agree completely with the central point of the chapter, that the church's most credible form of witness is the creation of a living, breathing, visible community of faith. In fact, the main thrust of this book, that the church is called to embody the story of the cross and that the world is called to live this way because that is what God is like, is an exciting and challenging vision for followers of Jesus. And it is one that has incredible life, particularly in the examples of specific people and specific congregations that the authors describe. However, it is a vision that seems to me to need further articulation, and that articulation brings us back once more to place. Let me try to explain in light of two biblical texts. The first is a text from Jeremiah 3, an exilic text, a text of lament. It seems to me that in the face of exile, in the face of a culture that does not know God, a culture that pledges allegiance to greed, consumerism, and violence, an appropriate response is lament. But note here that the lament is God's. Let me read these verses for you. I thought how I would set you among my children and give you a pleasant field, the most beautiful heritage of all nations. And I thought you would call me my father and would not turn from following me. Instead, as a faithless wife leaves her husband, so you have been faithless to me, O house of Israel, says the Lord. Can you hear the pathos in these verses? Can you hear the sorrow and grief? God's lament is not just that Israel will be going into exile, that lament is more clearly stated in Hosea 11, but rather that the land which God gave to Israel is now a place of faithlessness. Before Israel is sent into exile, God has been exiled in God's own land. Now, while judgment is the result of this exile, God's overwhelming response to Israel is one of grief. As Terence Fretheim puts it, the Godward side of judgment is always grief. Moreover, such lament is linked to the loss not only of the people, but of the land that God had hoped would be home for both Israel and God in relationship together. I'm emphasizing the lament of God because Hauerwas and Willimon emphasize that we behave as we do in community because we are image bearers of God. Okay, they don't use the word image bearers. They should have. But they say that we do the things that we do as church because God is like this. And God is one who laments the loss of the land and the loss of relationship. God laments the sinfulness of the people. The fact that everything has gone so terribly awry causes God terrible grief. We see this same lament when Jesus weeps over Jerusalem on the way to the cross and in the groaning of the Spirit along with creation and believers in Romans 8. If this is the basic stance of God, Jesus, and the Spirit to the brokenness and unfaithfulness of humanity, should this not also characterize the community that is shaped by the cross? It should, and I know that it does. There are people in this room whose lives are shaped by this kind of grief over the brokenness found both in and outside of our churches, by lament over the death that tears our communities apart. This is not a posture of offense or defense. It is rather a posture of suffering love. The second text I would like to focus on is also from Jeremiah, a text that contains specific instructions for how to live as resident aliens. It's found in Jeremiah 29. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. This is a very startling passage. The people of Israel are in exile at the heart of the Babylonian Empire. And God's heart is full of grief that they are no longer in the land that they were given as a gift and inheritance. So what does God say to them? God tells them to be what they were always supposed to be from the beginning of the story. From the beginning, they were called to serve and observe creation, to use Ellen Davis's translation of Genesis 2:15. To serve and observe creation. They were the ones who were to have dominion, guard the food supply, share the abundance of creation with their fellow creatures, fill the earth in order to fulfill this creational calling to tend and keep the whole earth. Needless to say, Israel failed miserably. And here is God saying, you know that calling about caring for the garden and eating of the abundance I have given you? You remember that, right? You remember that calling to have children who faithfully follow this calling as well? You didn't manage to do it when you were in your own land, but damn it, this is your calling. So you're going to have to try to fulfill it in exile. I have called you to care for your place. Well, this is your place. Tend and keep, and have children who tend and keep, that they may have children who tend and keep. Shaping a community is important here, but what kind of community? One that is at home here, where I have set you. One that seeks the peace of this place where I have put you. For only when you are seeking the peace of your imperial masters, only when you work to bring peace to the heart of the empire, will you find peace. You see, that grief of God from Jeremiah 3 and throughout Hosea isn't just because Israel was unfaithful in general. It was because Israel was unfaithful to the land itself, to the calling to care for this piece of land, to steward its resources, to share its abundance. That is why in Hosea 4, it isn't only God who mourns, but also the land. And so in Jeremiah 29, Israel is called to be faithful to the place she finds herself, the place of exile. Seek the peace of the place where you are, even if it is the heart of darkness. This isn't really that far from Paul's call to us in 2 Corinthians 5, is it? Where he says that we are ministers of reconciliation because in Christ God has reconciled the world to God's self. Why do we seek peace? Why do we seek reconciliation? Because God does. So when Hauerwas and Willimon state that the political task of Christians is to be the church rather than to transform the world, it seems to me that this is a false dichotomy. We are called to be the church and to seek the peace of the places we find ourselves in the world. Let us hope that that will bring reconciliation, shalom, repentance, and transformation. In the face of disembodied hopes for heaven, and in the face of a displaced culture, a rootless people, and a world of nomads, in the face of the destruction of our creational home, may we be the kind of resident aliens who heed the call of our God, that in exile we may seek to be a people who are rooted in a good creation, to seek its healing, its peace, and the peace and healing of our neighbors, whoever they are. If I were to summarize Sylvia's point, speaking from a place on the land at Russet House Farm where we live, it's almost kind of like I'm working on Resident Aliens, and I'm trying to figure out what to say, and it's kind of daunting, and I don't want to read all the reviews and all the literature over the years. So I went to the greenhouse, and I asked the seedlings, I said, hey, you guys feel like resident aliens? And I know they spoke, but I don't have the ears to quite hear and interpret their glossolalia. But there was this nanosecond averting of their gaze, and they just looked away from the sun for just a nanosecond, and they looked at me, and I knew what the look meant. The look was, what are you talking about? And I get wondering, if my plants aren't resident aliens, how do I care for them if I am? Thanks.
Thank you for this lovely occasion and for these responses. There's having to sit there and not be able to talk has just frustrated the hell out of me, and I probably got more to say than I should at this point. I understand it needs to be brief. I take it that some of what Brian has just suggested reaches back to Michael's suggestion about the metaphor of the colony and how the metaphor of the colony can suggest a kind of retreat of Christians from social engagement that suggest that there's a wall, a Roman wall. Boundaries are crucial, but the boundaries that the church, of course, entails are permeable. And they're permeable because we believe in witness and conversion of the outsider. And the outsider always scares the hell out of us because they hear the gospel and tell it back to us in ways that we were not anticipating. So there is no question. Part of the problem of the anti-Constantinian critique is it can give you the presumption that and invite a docetic account of ecclesiology. But in effect, the language of place is very important because there is no Christianity that does not produce material culture. The question is how do you produce a material culture which you then need to sustain in a manner that doesn't invite violence as part of the necessity to sustain it? So part of the very issues internally to the church is how we produce people who have the time to plant vineyards in a strange land in a manner that can, for the future, produce people who are able to maintain their distinctiveness for the world itself. Because the duality between church world is the fundamental duality that means that you are always a historic people discovering what it means for church to be church in relationship to the world being world. And never forget that Christians always assume that the church-world duality runs through us. It's not us-them, but runs through us. Part therefore of the question, where is the church that we are talking about? It is part of the strategy of resident aliens was to make us feel the oddness of the everyday convictions that produce Christians being able to sustain the material conditions necessary for the reproduction of the witness to the next generation. In that sense, there is an interpretive key to how Christians force us to see the significance of the everyday in a way that helps us recover who we are. And let me, in terms of the last remarks, relate that to Jeremiah's suggestion that what Christians are to do in the strange land is to build houses, plant gardens, and have children. Now, everybody thinks having children, we know how to do it. We know why we're doing it. But I think that's exactly one of the crucial places that you see today how Christians need to reclaim the materiality of our lives, just to the extent that we are a people who don't have enough hope in ourselves to have children, but have enough hope in God to have children. Because if what it means, my way of putting it is, we live in a world, and I think capitalism is a great engine of this. We live in a world called modernity, which thought its task is to produce a people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. We live in a time that wants to produce a people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. That's called freedom. Now, if you don't believe that's your story, I can illustrate it this way. Do you believe you ought to be held responsible for decisions you made when you did not know what you were doing? No, on the whole, most of us do not believe we should be held responsible for decisions we made when we did not know what we were doing. The only difficulty with that view is, of course, it makes marriage unintelligible. I mean, how would you ever know what you did when you promised lifelong monogamous fidelity? If it makes marriage unintelligible, try having children. You will never get the ones you want. Now, exactly part of the question becomes, under what conditions do you need to be a people? What do you need to practice in order to have children in a world as dark as this world? In a world as dark as this world. And that in having them then, the great enemy of Christianity is not unbelief today. I mean, if only we could get significant atheists. But since we're not significant believers, we have trouble producing significant atheists. The great enemy of Christianity is sentimentality. And there is no deeper view of sentimentality than the presumption that you should have children in a manner that your children are able to grow up to make up their own minds. What stupidity. Exactly in order to have children, you need to have the presumption that you are ready to have them suffer for your convictions. Now, it is under that kind of discipline that you begin to see how the church claims in materially what is necessary in place to produce children who, as a matter of fact, understand that they are among us as gifts from God to give us the necessities that help us recognize that we are not a people who believe we should have no story except the story when we had no story, but rather we are a people who understand we are storied, and by being storied, we provide an alternative to a world that is dying of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. We're now going to proceed to the reflection of chapter 2 with Eileen Van Ginkel. She's of 3, sorry, chapter 3. Thanks, Brian, keeping me on my toes. Chapter 3, Eileen is the Vice President of Ministry Services for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. We're very pleased to have you.
Thank you. I wanted to start just by telling you of my resonance with Resident Aliens, the title. When I was a student at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the 1970s, every September I had to fill out a resident alien card because that was my status according to the US government. All of us who came as Canadian students were resident aliens. So I understood that it does make you feel a bit odd or peculiar, not quite belonging. Actually, around that same time, the movie Alien came out. And if you take a look at the spelling of my name, you can see that 12 and 13-year-old boys had a lot of fun with it. But just that idea of resident aliens is one that a friend of mine said, that's not a very nice title. I said, well, I know what it feels like. I want to talk a little bit about evangelicals in post-Christendom Canada. And as I do so, I will do that through the lens of my work with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada over 25 years. That gives me a little bit of context to talk about the themes in Chapter 3. 25 years ago, 1989, this month was when I first started paid employment with the Evangelical Fellowship. So this gives me 25 years of history. And it is, in that sense, quite a good time to do some retrospective and take a look at what we were doing over those 25 years as we try to position ourselves in post-Christendom Canada. We talked about being the voice of evangelicals in Canada, as opposed to the conscience of the nation. That was at least the way it seemed some of our friends in the mainline churches were positioning themselves. We certainly didn't want to consider ourselves to be the moral majority, as some of our cousins to the south were talking. The request instead, and this was expressed repeatedly by the president of the time, of the EFC president, Brian Stiller, the request was to be seated at the table. We wanted to be at the table to discuss what is it that's good for this country? What is it that we believe justice to be all about? We were led in that, as I mentioned, by Brian Stiller, who was influenced in a lot of his thinking by people like Bernard Zylstra, Paul Marshall, Gerald Van de Zande. Gerald was with Citizens for Public Justice and founder of the Coalition for Religious Freedom in Education and the Ontario Multi-Faith Council for Equity in Education. And it was working with Gerald and Paul in particular. That was what I was doing 25 years ago. I was co-chair of the Social Action Commission. And I don't know if you know Gerald, but generally I was just his gopher. He certainly kept me busy. The issues of the day that we were addressing: child pornography, abortion, the inclusion of sexual orientation in the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, reproductive technologies, and education. And it was in education that I became most involved. Education issues like the banning of reciting the Lord's Prayer in the classroom, and not allowing religious education to be taught in public schools. Those were the two issues that were galvanizing the work of the Coalition for Religious Freedom and the EFC's part in that. As we addressed those issues, we tried to focus not so much on God says, and therefore you must, and we also tried to stay away from claiming our rights as Christians, that somehow we had some kind of a heritage that we could pull on. Instead, we tried to talk about our understanding of God's ways of working in God's creation in terms of justice for all people, all Canadians, all those who live in this country. We tried to express this in our submissions to Parliament, our briefs to the courts, and I have to say, in most cases, we lost. Those court cases, can't think of any that you would call a clear-cut victory. So we learned a lot of lessons along the way. The first lesson being winning isn't everything, but of course they all say that. The second lesson was more important, and that is, how do you define success? We came to realize that it wasn't about winning the court cases as such or getting our way when it came to changes in legislation. What success meant was simply being faithful to our understanding of God's ways in God's Word. And the third thing was that we really tried hard to act out of our belief that God's ways of working in the world reflected God's goodwill for all, the flourishing of all human beings, not just us, but all those living in this country. Now, this approach wasn't always easy. We weren't always consistent. We sometimes messed up. And one of the tensions that we had to learn to live with was that our donors, our supporters, didn't always get what we were trying to do. They thought, and with a leader like Brian Stiller, they probably thought with some reasonable expectation that EFC was all about kicking butt in Ottawa. We just didn't quite see it that way, and some of the presidents who succeeded Brian Stiller certainly didn't act that way. One of them is here, Gary Walsh. Bruce Clemenger, they both talked about the importance of a respectful and careful tone and timbre in our voice. That meant, of course, that the media went for other people who had more sexy sound bites than we did. But in any case, our effort was to find a way of living in post-Christendom that was in line, in keeping with our understanding of God's heart for God's world. I'm going to talk about some of the themes in chapter 3, but just before I do so, I just want to be a little bit personal in terms of when some of the lights turned on for me, and that would be just a reference to around 1989, when we established the Coalition for Religious Freedom and Education. It was a critical turning point, not so much in the theoretical understanding of where we were at, but in the experiential understanding. We realized that we were no longer living as Christians in Christendom, and certainly that we no longer constituted the majority of Canadians. And in doing that, I remember some conversations. Some people expressed fear, some people expressed anger, some people expressed a desire to go back to the way it used to be. But I think for me, there was a strong sense of excitement, a sense that perhaps now we could remove some of the deadwood that was dragging us down as church, and that we could be true witnesses to what we understood to be God's word for God's world. And there was also a sense of relief that our task of faithfulness meant that we must leave things in God's hands. It wasn't up to us. And so you can see why the theme of adventure in chapter 3 of Resident Aliens resonated. I appreciated that adventure was expressed by Drs. Hauerwas and Willimon as synonymous with discipleship. And in some ways, the term adventure perhaps grabs us in a way that the word discipleship doesn't. But it's very apt in any case, given the excitement that we experience in getting to know Jesus, in getting to know who he is and what he's doing in the world. And in looking at that, in hearing the invitation, there's real excitement in taking up the invitation to join Jesus in God's mission of reconciliation. So I appreciated also in the book, in chapter 3, the emphasis on story, the story of God's love, and that story helps to situate our lives in the world as it did for Jesus. I'm just going to read from the bottom of 54, going into 55. Story is the fundamental means of talking about and listening to God, the only human means available to us that is complex and engaging enough to make comprehensible what it means to be with God. The story emphasis answers the why question. Why are we being called into God's mission? What is God's mission, God's story, all about? The second part of chapter 3 deals with virtues for the journey, the adventure. And that emphasis answers the how question. How do we engage in that adventure? There's reference to an eschatological ethic that the end of the journey is true and complete friendship with God. So there's purpose, there is a goal. And this sense of purpose and goal helps us on the journey. There's also talk about virtues of revolutionary thinking and constancy. And these virtues seem to me to be helpful, but I wonder also about the virtue of trust, and wondered if we could think about working into the journey motif the idea of heart postures. How do we position ourselves in relation to God as we are walking this journey? How do we position our hearts in relation to other people and to creation as a whole? Trust, in that sense, is to me not a virtue so much as a heart posture. And along with that would come humility and resting in God's ways, not striving in our own ways. I think it's also helpful to look at the communal practices of worship, prayer, and discernment as we're on that journey, that adventure. We need to take the time together to focus on Jesus, on who he is, who we are with Jesus. We need time to connect with Jesus in prayer. And we need to take the time to discern, to hear the voice of Jesus as he calls to us, letting us know where the twists and turns are in the road, and showing us the path that we hadn't seen, the path that veers in new directions. I think these heart postures, these communal practices then could help sustain us in the virtues necessary as we go on the journey, as we take part in God's adventure. In conclusion, I think that it's probably true to say that many evangelicals in Canada are still adapting to the post-Christendom reality. I was with a group of police officers on Tuesday, and they began the conversation that I had with them bemoaning the fact that so many things that used to be taken for granted can no longer be taken for granted in Canadian society. But as we talked, they began to agree that perhaps it is okay to let some of the props go, the things that just kept us up artificially in a sense of Christendom, a sense of Christian society. And they began to see also and express in their tone of voice, the looks of their faces, the excitement of getting to be part of this story, this adventure of being in God's mission, in God's world. And it's that excitement in the why, answering the why question, answering the how question, that really got the conversation going. And so I thank you, Stanley Hauerwas and Will Williman, for this book and for the opportunity to comment on it.
Seems to me that there's been a theme in the last two presentations that this is kind of your question, but what difference does it make that both of us are located in the United States and many of you are not? And how we read that, just to say, I would just say be careful. When you claim, hey, we've kind of gotten over Constantinianism up here. We made that before you guys and all. It almost makes me glad that, I'm a United States citizen, where it is just perhaps more dramatic that, Barack Obama is not the hope of the world, as opposed to having a nice person as a Premier of Canada or something. I remember we got a letter from somebody in Ireland incensed that we had used Ananias and Sapphira from Acts as a positive example of a good church meeting. And and don't lie to me, you've all wanted to see some of your church trustees dead. And I remember Stanley wrote back and said, I'm sorry, when we say world, we're thinking of the Pentagon, okay? And probably in Ireland, you'd miss that when you hear world. I think we did put forward the church as a kind of heuristic device that when we say community, this is what we think about, the church as God's fallen, conflicted, but yet model sense of this is where we're headed. To me, part of the good news in that is that, as I think we put it, rather than running errands for the world, rather than trying to expend all of our energies and legislatively forcing everybody to do something that we think is good, a much harder task would be to form the church. I mention that because lots of you are pastors, and you spend most of your lives worrying about the stuff that is required to keep God's people together in this place. And I hope President Aliens said, that's hard work, but that is utterly essential work. So when we hear the word, Stanley famously said, the church doesn't have a social program. The church is a social program. Well, in a sense, when the church says something like mission, what we ought to mean is church, and that is that, inviting people into this alternative community, and that's what you pastors do. And I think there's a weird sense in which the world has restored the beauty of that. My church was involved in a conference-wide discussion about the health care plan in America. And we decided, gosh, this is something we can be for. This is something that is needed. This is something that would help a lot of people. And we spent most of our time reassuring people, no, we'll do health care differently than Canada, where you have to wait 10 years for a kidney or something. We'll do it differently, and we'll be better. Mainly, the debate was an attack on Canadian health care, which was an interesting thing. I said, I've been to Canada. They seem pretty healthy to me. And but after one of these exhausting meetings about, is this socialized medicine? Is this good? Who would be blessed by this and all? I came home and I flipped on the TV, and there was a discussion of a group of godless economists. Maybe that's a tautology, but, and they were all healthcare economists. And they were debating, could we afford health care at this level? And can we have health care with absolutely no cost controls? And, doing the thing economists do. And then this one economist, whose name was Rubenstein, whom I assume might not be a Methodist, but Dr. Rubenstein said, the biggest problem is how the heck do you provide health care to people who think they might be God, immortal? And he said, we're not debating health care here. We're debating a system that spends most of its funds not vaccinating children, but in the last year of your life. That's not health care. That's immortality fantasy. And who is going to be courageous enough to tell Americans they're going to have to die one way or another? And I sat there and, as a Christian preacher, felt so ashamed that this godless economist was telling more truth than I was telling on Sunday morning. And part of the adventure is to just, the world, in an odd way, the world convincing us how odd it is following a Jew from Nazareth who lived briefly and died violently and rose unexpectedly and then returned to the very losers who betrayed him the first time. How odd that is, believing that is true. And there's a weird sense in which the world can do that for us. And those who charge resident aliens with being kind of anti-political, I can see their point. I mean, we're two guys from the Vietnam War generation, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other hand, we did say we're appealing for a different kind of polis, a different kind of politics to find out on a different kind of polis, and that is when we say politics, we're supposed to think, the first thing we're supposed to think of is church. God's peculiar power arrangement configuration. God's answer to what's wrong with the world. And that's political. And the good news is that's what many of you spend your lives doing, and is trying to build this alternative community that is something the world can never be through even the best legislation, because God, not nations, rules the world.
Thank you, Will. This is our last reflection, chapter 4, before we go for lunch. So I'd just like to welcome up Joseph Mangina. He is a professor of systematic theology at Wycliffe, and he serves on the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue Commission for Canada. We're very happy to have you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, and what a wonderful pleasure it is and honor to be here on this day commemorating 25 years of Resident Aliens. Can you believe that, Stanley and Will, that much water under the bridge? And my, actually, I didn't bring my copy of the book up with me. Can you? My difficulty, I think, saying anything about this book is that with respect to Stanley in particular, I've been so shaped by his thoughts that sometimes I don't know when they're my thoughts and when they're his thoughts. But let me just begin by saying Stanley famously said of himself that he was a high church Mennonite. That came out, I think he said that in the preface to Community of Character. Well, I think I'm here today to hold up the high church end of things. I'm an Anglican, I'm a systematic theologian, and let's just see what that perspective might bring to an understanding of this book. I think I want to begin by reminding us all what might seem to be obvious, that Stanley and Will are members of the Yale School. What could be more clear than that? They were both educated at Yale University, studied in the Divinity School, the Religious Studies department there. But actually, I'm not talking about the Yale School of Hans Frey and George Lindbeck and Paul Homer and those great teachers who were there in the 60s and 70s. I'm actually talking about the Yale School of the 1740s. What do I mean by that? Well, in the 1740s, there was a revival going on in America, primarily in the colonial America. I think it reached up north of the border here. So there was a kind of, the Spirit was moving, and what we came to know as the Great Awakening was underway. And it touched Yale University, which had, of course, been founded as a Congregationalist institution, very much in the Reformed tradition, but already by the 1740s had become kind of moribund and orthodox. And so there was a tension between the fairly staid Presbyterian Congregationalist faculty and the students who were beginning to experience the new wave of revival. And one of the students was David Brainerd. And Brainerd famously said of his tutor at Yale that, quote, he had no more grace than a chair. No more grace than a chair. And he ended up going down to a new institution that was just being founded called the College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, where he became a student of Jonathan Edwards's. Now, why do I mention the revival of the 1740s? Because I think that in some respects we can say that Resident Aliens is itself a kind of revivalist tract. What is revivalism? Revivalism is an attempt to breathe new life into a dead ecclesial institution. It's meant to fan the flames, the embers, of a dying church so that people might know the Lord once again. I think that in many ways, Resident Aliens is, I mean, it's your only best-selling book, right, Stanley? It's when you, right? Will did it. It was Will's cut with those stories by Will made this a bestseller. So Resident Aliens is revival literature. More broadly, you could say it's a kind of edifying writing. It's meant to build up the church. It's meant to encourage the weary. I think pastors and ministers and priests in particular took heart from this book. It gave them a sense that what they were doing was worthwhile, that hanging in with the church and with Jesus made a difference. I think this was a life-changing book for many people. So I think it's interesting to read Resident Aliens as a kind of revivalist literature aimed at a church, and this is what revivalism does, aimed at a church that had become too worldly, a church that no longer knew that it was the church. And when I say that the church had become too worldly, very clearly, and this has come out in the talks already today, the world here means the Pentagon, but more broadly, liberal, middle-class society with its privatized ethics, its loneliness, its uncritical support of the nation-state. But most of all, liberal societies and the liberal church's capacity to render God invisible. It is, to use the phrase that Stanley and Will employ, it's the practical atheism, not so much out there in the culture, but the practical atheism in the church. And I think the reason that this book was heard as liberating by both lay people and clergy was giving them a renewed sense that God matters. And that's a point that I want to come back to. Now, like any good revival preacher, Hauerwas and Willimon know or hope that their audience already have an incipient sense of sin, a vague sense of conviction that needs to be named and articulated. And thus, if the subtitle of the book is Life in the Christian Colony, the phrase that appears on the cover, I assume it's a publisher's blurb, a provocative Christian assessment of culture and ministry for people who know that something is wrong. Was that from the publisher, Stanley? Yeah. But I think it put its finger on something. It's for people who already sense that something is wrong, but they didn't know how to articulate it. And what Stanley and Will offer in this book is an articulation of sort of inchoate sense of unease, dis-ease in the church. Now, it's precisely because Stanley and Will are writing in this edifying or revivalist mode that chapter 4, that it reads like a patrolling of the border between the church and the world, or between the church and liberal culture, right? And that's why I think that's part of the effectiveness of the book. And I actually think this describes a lot of the writing of both men more broadly than this. The reason that it has hooks into our lives, the reason that it arouses interest in the church, is that rather than simply, clearly they don't want a Christian discourse that simply imitates and images the world's discourse. The whole point is to underscore the particularity, the uniqueness, the peculiarity of Christian faith and practice. But on the other hand, they don't simply inhabit the safe precincts of theology and church life. They're patrolling that boundary. And as Stanley said a little while ago, the line between the church and the world runs through each of us and through each of our communities. And so paying attention to the worldliness within ourselves and within the church is part of what makes the book so effective. This book, besides being a work of theology, is it's a kind of theology of culture or cultural critique from a Christian perspective. So we learn a lot about being a Christian from this book. We also learn a lot about the society that we live in and that lives in us. So it becomes this is part of what I mean when I say it's an edifying literature. It encourages and increases self-knowledge. Now, there are also dangers with this mode of proceeding. Because to patrol the border between the church and the world means inevitably that you're engaged in some kind of apologetics, right? You're making a case. And apologetics, of course, comes from the ancient Greek world, the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato. An apology is a defense, it's an account of oneself, it's a representation of yourself, perhaps against the misrepresentations. Ultimately, the context in which apologies came about in the ancient world, the Greek word means a defense. So it came about in a legal context. It's when you're defending yourself against accusations. Now, the problem with Christian apologetics is, any kind of apologetics, is that you run certain risks. One risk would be defensiveness, where you kind of circle the wagons, you're defining yourself over and against the other. And I know that sometimes Stanley in particular has been criticized for emphasizing the opposition between the church as polis and the secular polis, the liberal polis, that you end up defining yourself over actually as a mirror image of that other. I'm not going to go into that. It's an interesting critique. I think sometimes it's been unfairly prosecuted. I think there might be some grains of truth in it. But I'm not going to sort of explore that side of things. But defensiveness is one problem. Misrepresentation of the other is another problem. And a third problem with apologetics is, and I'm learning here there's a great Jewish thinker from the early 20th century named Franz Rosenzweig that I'm borrowing from here. I've just been reading a dissertation by a brilliant Jewish student at the U of T on Rosenzweig, specifically on this question of apologetics. And one of the points that Rosenzweig makes is that a danger in apologetic writing and thinking is that you end up not just misrepresenting the other potentially, but essentializing or limiting yourself. That is to say, in the very act of defining yourself vis-a-vis the other, vis-a-vis the culture in which you find yourself, you give even a selective or perhaps a distorted account of your own identity, because you're so focused on the apologetic points, the points you want to make, that you lose a sense of what you really are about as a community or as a self. There's a certain irony in apologetics. So let's give a couple of examples of classic modern apologists. Friedrich Schleiermacher gave an account, a defense, a justification, if you will, of the Christian faith with respect to religious experience. He said all of us are religious creatures, that's what it means to be human, and so there's a certain religious affectivity, experience that is at the ground, the center of being human, and boy, we can make sense of Christianity in light of that general human capacity. Now, aside from the theological problems entailed with Schleiermacher's account, and there are many, the irony there is that precisely at the point where Schleiermacher chooses to engage the debate with the world, right, emotion, affectivity, there's actually a kind of constricted affectivity in a theology like Schleiermacher's, right? Because you're so trying to give a rational account of that thing, it's the very thing that you're focused on to you hope will justify yourself, that you actually have a blind spot for. Let's take another example. Reinhold Niebuhr, great Christian theologian that Stanley has had one or two things to say about in the course of his writing career. Reinhold Niebuhr chooses sin as his place where he's going to prosecute an apologetic argument. We all have a sense that there's something wrong with ourselves. The human being is both finite and free, and we can't quite put those things together. We always know that we fall short. We always are kind of haunted by a sense of existential guilt. Well, by goodness, doesn't that take us right into the heart of the New Testament? Because if we all know we're sinners, then we can receive the forgiveness that Christ brings. You see, Reinhold Niebuhr was in his own way a revivalist preacher, right? But you develop a blind spot to the very place where you pursue your apologetics. So in some respects, sin is actually a blind spot on Niebuhr's horizon because he doesn't understand that you can only understand what it means to be a sinner in light of the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Right? Now, might it be too much to argue that there might be something similar going on in Resident Aliens? Because what is the focus of the apologetic enterprise here in this, and I'll have to say it, wonderful book, wonderful and life-giving and renewing book that I've profited from, and we all have. But is there a blind spot here with respect to the church? Because that, in a way, is where Stan and Will have pitched their tent and said, we're going to offer an account of being a Christian to people in the church, in a society that's skeptical of the church, but still might have some interest in what it means to be a community, that knows something about the loneliness and sense of isolation of modern liberal society, right? To offer an account of the Christian faith for people who are looking for something more than just going to work, accumulating material wealth, and turning on the TV or the internet at the end of the day. Okay. Now, precisely because the church or Christian community is, if you will, the set of hooks that Stanley and Will use to invite people in, is there perhaps a blind spot with respect to the church? And here I want to come back to my theme of revivalism. Revivalism, the reason I come back to that theme is that revivalism seemed to be in very much the same situation with respect to Christendom that Resident Aliens occupies. That is, you assume the church exists, you need to fan the embers, you need to bring it to life. But the problem with revivalism in the 18th and 19th centuries is that it didn't have staying power. The self kept having to reinvent itself as you hear the revivalist preacher's message, you have a life-changing experience, but then what do you do the next day when you wake up? Now, in some ways, Resident Aliens is aimed against a kind of revivalist model of Christianity, right? Stanley and Will, like so many of us, I think, are both recovering pietists, and they're looking for a more stable and enduring model of church than Protestant pietism and, for that matter, Protestant liberalism were able to deliver. I suppose my question might be, is the church that's evoked by Resident Aliens, I think there's an ambiguity here that was nicely captured by Brian in his talk this morning when he pointed to that passage on page 38, where on the one hand, the church is this radical witness over against the world, and one that gives us the resources to keep on keeping on, the church as the Christian epistemology, if you will. And on the other hand, the church as this fallen institution that sort of aids and abets our worst habits. Now, it seems to me that in some ways, the ambiguity or tension of the book at that point is potentially its greatest strengths, because the church is both of those things. The church is God's colony in the world. The church is the community of disciples sent, called and sent and empowered as witnesses of Jesus Christ. And it's the fallen community. It's the frail community. It is simultaneously justified and a sinner. And Will spoke earlier about the fallenness of the church. But that presumes that we are not the ones who invent the church. I would think that the temptation of Resident Aliens might be to encourage the notion that the church of Christendom is fallen and we have to go invent some other church, right? That we have to have a kind of a creative, countercultural. I always tell my students, don't use the word countercultural, because it means absolutely nothing without some sort of context, right? That we have to, if you will, invent the church and create a radical community of witness from scratch. Personal testimony time. I'm an Anglican. God help me, right? I sit in a church on Sunday morning that is in many ways as accommodated, as unradical. I mean, it's one of the last bastions of Christendom in Ontario, probably, right? We are kind of a musical, liturgical bubble. We've got gorgeous music, a beautiful liturgy. People drive halfway across town to come to St. Martin's, right? We share in many of the weakest aspects of what it means to be an Anglican or a mainline Christian. We have a lot to repent of. Nevertheless, I believe that when I walk through the doors of St. Martin's on Sunday mornings, I am in Christ's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I don't have to invent that church. I don't have to summon it up by being a community of radical moral and social and political witness. I know that the church is there in all its tiredness and all of its frailty and all of its misguidedness by virtue of God's promise in the Word and the sacrament, but more centrally in Jesus Christ, to whom Word and sacrament bear witness. Okay. So it seems to me that Resident Aliens occupies a somewhat ambiguous place. On the one hand, I think that Stanley and Will, at their best, gesture precisely to that church that actually exists and that we don't need to invent. Right? I think the reason that they are able to point to those stories of ordinary, unassuming, unpretentious Christian discipleship, those quiet lives we could so easily overlook, is because the church really is there. We don't need to conjure it into being. But, on the other hand, some of the apologetic or revivalist rhetoric of the church over against the world, over against the secular polis, might encourage the notion that we have to invent the church. I don't think that was their intention, but I just kind of wonder 25 years later if I'd be interested in hearing from both of them how the book has been received. I certainly think that a lot of the students who come to Wycliffe College nowadays are rootless evangelicals who are tired of feeling that they have to invent the church, but that they can enter into a tradition of divine faithfulness even to a fallen and imperfect church, where you can kind of relax and enjoy the grace. Thank you.
Joe's a good and old friend. Everything he said is exactly right. It's the articulation of the tension that is clearly there that I'm not quite sure what to do with. I am a communicant at the Church of the Holy Family in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I worried that when I first became a communicant at the Church of the Holy Family, since Holy Family is usually associated with Catholic churches, that it might not be an Episcopal church, but as soon as they used the language of the Undercroft to describe the basement, I knew they were Episcopalians. Let no pretension go unused. Therefore, I am a Catholic Christian, just as Joe suggests, and I care deeply about sustaining the Church of the Holy Family for the future. And I think that there is nothing more politically radical than the sustaining of such churches for the future, because it is through such churches that we know that embodied in their everyday practices is the story of God that helps us locate the God we actually worship as Christians. Because I was raised an evangelical Methodist. That is, you could join the church on Sunday morning, but everyone knew you had to be saved on Sunday night after an hour hymn sing and a 45-minute sermon. I oftentimes say I became a theologian because I couldn't get saved, namely, when I was 15, I'd started to date, and therefore I was sinning. And I wanted to be saved, but I didn't think you should fake it. Finally, one night I thought, we were singing I Surrender All for the 23rd time, and I thought this is going to go on all night unless someone does something, so I dedicated my life to Jesus. I read some books and discovered the Bible wasn't true, and I decided I didn't believe in God, but then I went to college and discovered I wasn't smart enough to be an atheist yet. And decided to go to divinity school to find out if the stuff was true. In divinity school, I read Karl Barth, and the rest is history. And from Barth, I got exactly the kind of criticism that Joe suggests, namely the criticism of American pietism that assumed that you had to first discover you were a sinner before you could be saved. That's exactly wrong. You only, as Barth argues, you only know you're a sinner on your way out of it. And you're on your way out of it because you cannot let sin determine redemption, because Christ refuses to let our sin determine our identity. And that's true for all history. And therefore, crucial for part of, if resident, I think probably Joe is right, as much as I hate to acknowledge it, Will and I probably are recovering pietists. But as I will talk about this afternoon, I think pietism is the source of American rationalism and its destructive character. But part of, therefore, the project of showing the centrality of Christology for the recovery of the joyfulness of being the church is how that, and this is one of the other tensions in the book, is how that Christology provides the interpretive framework for helping you locate what sin may be in terms of how it is destructive for Christian and non-Christian alike in the world in which we live. Could the kinds of criticisms of liberalism that we make in the book be made whether you are a Christian or not? And that is part of the strong challenges that I think the kind of analysis that Joe provides is so important. Certainly, I think one of the great books of modernity is Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption. And I think there's no question that he saw how he could not let Christianity determine how he understood his Jewishness. And that is crucial, I think, for us, because we cannot let the critique of liberalism determine our understanding of Christianity and what it is that we discover as Christians through the worship of God day in and day out, by which, as I will try to say this afternoon, the fundamental stance that we must assume as Christians is prayer. We are people who have been created to pray, and that is hopefully very good news for the world, in which the world discovers what it so desperately desires. Thank you very much for a lovely morning.
Thank you to Stanley and Will for the first half of the day. Thanks to all the contributors so far. We're now going to break for lunch. So, just got a few announcements to let you know. If you are leaving, if you have a vehicle here and you're leaving, to avoid paying twice for parking, there's two things you can do. You can either just walk to lunch, which is a good old-fashioned thing, which I've noticed Canadians don't do a lot of, frankly. But Irish people walk everywhere. You guys drive from one house to your next door neighbor. It's ridiculous. So you can walk outside, which is just the intersection outside. There's a number of places you can eat. You can just take a little danders, I would say, over there and eat. Or you can eat at the hotel. Or you can buy a $10 voucher, which you need to buy before 1 o'clock, which means you can come in and out of here for $10 all day. So you know what? I'll leave that to you guys. That's a decision that you and only you can make. Okay? So go and have a great lunch, and we will see you at 1:10 sharp. Sound good? Great. Have a great lunch and a great break. Be refreshed.